Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And as a member of the Select Committee that considered the Education Amendment Bill, I'd like to rise and speak to Part 2 because, Mr Chair, it's some time ago now since the Select Committee actually considered the wording in this legislation, and a lot has happened since then. And I do wonder whether the Select Committee may have had some different views if we had known then what we know now. Because this Part 2 actually requires early childhood education centres, for example, to have some additional costs put on them by going through some vetting procedures and to do them in, as my colleague Marion Street just said, in a truncated period of time to what the original legislation said. Now, of course, at the foremost of the minds of the Select Committee at the time when we wanted that truncated was the safety of the children, as it should have been. And we wanted to make sure that there were as few loopholes as possible. But, Mr Chair, that was before we learned that there were to be budget cuts for the early childhood education sector. And I think that now, in reflection, as I looked at this entire bill, but particularly in Part 2, the costs that are contained in here for the sector were not a major concern for the Select Committee at the time, because at that point in time we believed that government was not going to tamper with early childhood education funding. We believed that it was in place because the government had promised that. They'd promised it before the election, and we had no reason to doubt that. But of course now this week we learn that actually the early childhood education sector suddenly is costing too much. Suddenly the government has decided just this week that it is costing too much and that funding must be cut from the early childhood education sector. And in Part 2, the sector is required to undertake police vetting procedures that it has not been required to undertake up until this point. And the timing of this is going to be incredibly important because Part 2 actually is the transitional provisions. And because we don't know when this Act will come into power, because it commences on the day after which it receives assent, and so it hasn't got a named date in here. We don't know whether this will occur before the budget. It's unlikely to, but it could. But the transitional provisions are likely to come into place and be a requirement for the early childhood education sector following the budget. And we do not know, because the government will not say, what cuts to funding the sector will be placed in by then. So the Select Committee, and as a member of that Select Committee, I find myself in a very difficult position, supporting this legislation because it is the right thing to do for the safety of our children, but really now being very, very worried about the sector's capability to actually put these measures in place, to actually go through these police vetting processes, to make sure this is done thoroughly and properly, because I do not know, and neither does the sector, we do not know the level of the funding cuts that they are facing in the budget coming up on the 20th of May. So here we are today, debating in the committee stages a piece of information, and when we were doing the committee stages last week, I felt less worried about the funding position of the sector than I do this week. And so next week, when we're debating, perhaps we may be doing the third reading. I don't know when we'll be doing the third reading of this bill. But what on earth will we be facing when we do the third reading of this bill? What situation will the sector be in? Where will their capability be to actually deliver what we did in good faith in the Select Committee, what the submitters came and told us about in good faith, because they wanted these changes to be put in place as well. But they didn't know, and neither did we on the Select Committee, did not know the plans that government had for cutting funding to the sector. And the reason we did not know about those plans is because the government promised. It said it would not tamper with early childhood education. It said it would keep the same level of subsidies. It said it would keep the same fee controls in place. It promised that before the election. Now those promises look shallow. They are ringing completely hollow. Now all the government can do is talk about how much it costs for the government to actually support children through early childhood education. Well, for goodness sake, when the government keeps saying it wants to improve participation and have more children in early childhood education, of course the cost is going to be larger.
Kelvin Davis. I'd just like to follow on from what my colleague Sue Moroney has been saying about the police vetting and the need for support for principals and boards of trustees within schools to go through that process. It's actually quite a simple process, really, when you think about it, but unfortunately in schools, many school leaders were trained purely as teachers. They used to get very little training in the art and the skills of being a principal, let alone training in the sort of legal stuff that principals now have to do. So there's a real gap in the knowledge of many principals between the art of leading the school in terms of the curriculum and this administrative work, much of it which is based around legal needs. And the process of a police vet is actually quite simple. It's a matter of filling in a form and posting it off. But that, along with all the other requirements that principals have when they employ staff, it builds up on principals, and often they don't really do the administrative tasks in the timely manner that they should. Now, I support the fact that the time lag, or the time frame has been shortened from 8 weeks to 4 weeks in terms of applying for a police vet. I actually think it could be done even faster still. However, one of the problems with the police vet taking having a limit of 4 weeks for the police vet to be applied for is that there is a lag where this person who we're unsure of their criminal background is allowed to work in a school. The application has to be filled out within 4 weeks, and yet there's another 4 or 5 week lag between actually receiving the police vet back. So in a school, that could mean that a teacher has been working in the school for close to a term or a quarter of a school year without actually knowing the status of their criminal history. And there is, well, hopefully they wouldn't have a criminal history, but so there is that danger there. Going along the same theme or the same lines of principals not having the legal background and knowledge to follow processes or not having the training to allow them to follow the processes, I just flick back to the first part of the bill that talks about what happens when a police vet is returned, and I'm talking about section 319 FA that says that principals shouldn't take any adverse